Welcome back to the OFFbit. Today we're looking at the legendary Intel Q6600. In 2007, this was the go-to gaming CPU. So we've married it today with the GTX660, and we're going to see how much relevance this is today with gaming in 2020. Stick around and find out. This is the Intel Q6600. The Intel Q6600 was Intel's first quad-core CPU, released in January 2007. Codenamed Kensfield, this CPU was essentially two Core 2 duos slapped together on the same CPU board. The Core 2 duo at the time was already making a big splash in the water, so using two of these side by side made this CPU a monster for its time. With the clock being at a reasonable 2.4 GHz, the CPU was based on a 65nm fabrication node, having 8MB level 2 cache and running on a frontside bus of 1066 MHz. Running off the LGA775 platform and having a TDP of 95 or 105 watts depending on its S-spec number. The legendary Q6600 had an introduction price of $530 USD, making this a go-to CPU for PC gamers. Though the price was essentially just over twice as much as a regular Core 2 duo, it gave the customers some longevity until the new CPUs came along. Intel did make later Core 2 quads on the LGA775 platform, but the Core 2 quad was essentially run down by Nehalem Intel i7s, introduced as early as late 2008. This is our NVIDIA GTX660. The GTX660 was launched with the GTX650 on September 13th, 2012. Based on the Kepler architecture and codenamed as the GK106-400-A1. The GTX660 is built on the 28nm manufacturing node. This variant of the GTX660 we have today is from Gigabyte. This is the GV-N6600OC-2GD. This variant is packed with 2GB of GDDR5 RAM clocked at 6008 MHz on a 192-bit bus. This GPU has a base clock of 1033 MHz and boost clocks hitting up to as high as 1098 MHz in stock configuration. Though the card is a medium level video card, it still can pack a punch and will definitely be doing a good job married today with our Core 2 Quad Q6600. Our GTX 660 supports the following APIs: Direct3D 11 and Functional Direct3D 12.0, OpenCL 1.2, OpenGL 4.6 and supports Vulkan 1.1. The motherboard we're using today is from Gigabyte. We have the GA-G41MT-S2P. The revision of the board we're using today is revision 1.3. This is a fairly basic motherboard supporting only 2 DIMMs of DDR3 RAM. This motherboard supports front-side buses of 1333, 1066 and 800 MHz. Based off the G41 chipset, this has one X16 PCIe slot, 2 PCIe X1 slots and a single PCI slot. RAM we're using today is from Kingston. This is the KVR 1333 D39K2/8G. This is basically an 8GB DDR3 dual stick kit. So we got 2 sticks of 4GB running at 1333 MHz. Hard drives are running today. We have one 120GB Western Digital Green SSD. We also have one 240GB Western Digital Green SSD for the games. We're also running a 1TB Western Digital Green magnetic hard drive, also for some of the bigger games. And our Windows 10 today is build 2004. This will be on the 120GB Western Digital SSD. Alright, let's go check out our synthetic benchmarks. 7-zip, our Q6600 at our stock 2.4 GHz scored us 2,495 points for its single core, and multi-core 8,248 points. Though we are in last, we have to remember this was the first of the quad cores and it was basically versus dual cores at the time. However, the Q6600 is still hanging in there and is not that far lagging behind. In CPU-Z CPU-ID, we scored 209.1 points for the Q6600, and for multi-core we scored 698.5 points. Interestingly enough, we pushed out in front of the AMD FX 4100 and we're not too far behind the Q8400. In Citybench R15, we scored for the Q6600 174 points, which we are considerably behind a lot of other CPUs in this list. The next one up is the AMD FX 4100, and that's almost double of what we scored. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Q6600 holds out in 2020. Right, let's check out the GTX660. Continue on with Citybench R15. The GTX660 scored 41.67 frames per second, sitting us last behind the E5430 Core 2 Quad Xeon, with the GTX750 scoring 49 frames per second. In Unigine heaven, the Q6600 with the GTX660 scored us 826 points, leaving us just a fine margin between the i5-760 with the same video card, and just pushing out in front by about 200 points over the GTX750 on the E5430. In 3D Mark's Firestrike benchmark, the Q6600 with the GTX660 scored 4,126 points. If we look at the i5-760 with the GTX660 just in front there, now you can see how the CPU actually can give you different benchmarks results. So we can probably say that the Q6600 is holding the GTX660 back just a bit, but generally you find with slower CPUs, it will affect the outcome of the total GPU performance. Overall, I think things looking pretty promising for the game. So without further ado, let's jump into our first game, Overwatch. We ran Overwatch at 1080p with medium resolution. At these settings, it gave us a pretty enjoyable experience. It wasn't super smooth, but it wasn't laggy and it wasn't stuttery. So in other words, the gameplay played well enough that you didn't get distracted by hardware problems. Jumping into the stats, the average frame rate for Overwatch was 42.1 frames per second. Minimum frame rate fell to 8.9 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate was 77.1 frames per second. 0.1% lows was at 2.7 frames per second. So that also reflected basically how we felt about the game. So thumbs up for the Q6600 with the GTX660 and Overwatch. Hero of the Storm basically has no problems with lag. Game played silky smooth through the whole time. We had the settings set at Ultra at 1080p, which is no surprise for us at the OFFbit. We were expecting this game to play quite well. Frame rates for Heroes of the Storm. Average frame rate was 41.9 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 20.9 frames per second, and maximum frame rate was 67.8 frames per second. The 0.1% lows was at 7.8 frames per second. So basically, no input lag, no load stutter. This game played great, and we had it at high settings. So if you're playing HOTS on the Q6600 with the GTX660, it's going to be sweet. In PUBG, we set the settings to 720p with graphics set to the lowest that we could set. Surprisingly enough, this game actually ran pretty good. It didn't give us any major stutters with load, and it didn't have any real glitches or problems loading images and models in. The CPU was working very hard in this title, but I think it gave us a fairly consistent frame rate, so it didn't actually feel bad. It played pretty good. Now, our statistics, our frame rates weren't actually that great either. Anyway, let's look at the frame rates. Average frame rate for PUBG was 39.4 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 18.6 frames per second. Maximum frame rate hit 103.1 frames per second, which is quite high. I must have been staring at the floor or something, but it was more likely probably a menu. Our 0.1% lows hit 4.5 frames per second. So our recorded frame rates pretty much show what we're saying. The game ran fairly good with about 40 frames per second on average. It did have a few little dips here there at the minimum frame rates, but nothing major with big stutters. We did also flick it into 1080p, and the average frame rate was probably around about 30 frames a second. So it still actually played all right. So not too bad for a title that a lot of people think is not very well optimized. However, I think these days this is much the contrary. I think with the updates and patches that they've been putting through, they've definitely helped optimize how this game plays, and it has affected the bottom line and made it a lot better for low entry systems. Genshin Impact. What a pretty game. Now, we ran this at 1080p at the high settings. Now, while we're playing this game, we did notice and we did experience some load stutter. The CPU generally sat at 100%, so it was just hanging on. So that's probably where some of that load stutter came in, where it just got bottlenecked with too much throughput to happen. Now, if we did turn the graphics down and probably more of those draw distances, we'd probably experience no load stutters or minimal. Overall, the game played quite fun. Really good gameplay. No problems with hardware. Look, it did load here and there, but because of the nature of this game, it didn't affect the gameplay all that much. Frame rates for Genshin Impact. Average frame rate was 45.8 frames per second. Minimum frame rate hit 26.4 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate was 60.6 frames per second. 0.1% lows hit 4.5 frames per second. So the frame stats show pretty good. So this game ran really well. So this is a thumbs up for the Q6600 and the GTX660. Running Sea of Thieves, this game we ran at 1080p and we set the settings to the lowest they could be, also known as cursed. Now this game wanted to play smoothly, but as you can see there, every now and then you try to do something and it just hurts you. Hand-to-hand combat was virtually impossible, giving you some stutter and smoothness and stutter. When you were sailing, generally the game ran pretty smooth until you got to an island and it then had to load the whole island in. Now when it was loading that detail, you would get about a second of stutter. I'd love to recommend this game on this setup, but I just can't. It was just too hard. It's just going to drive you insane. If something happens, you're going to be done really quickly. Average frame rate for Sea of Thieves was 49.4 frames per second. Minimum frame rates was 0.2 frames per second. Maximum frame rates hit 72.9 and our 0.1% lows was 0.2 as well. So as you can see, lots of loading problems. There's big stutters and then there's smooth frame rates. So it's exactly what we were saying. Now, the CPU was pretty much living at 100%. So this is where all the stutters are from. So this is where the game is getting held back. The GTX660 cannot do its work because the CPU is just taking too much time. So I'm going to give that a no for Sea of Thieves in this setup. But look, you could still find it playable. It's just not going to be great. In Fortnite, we ran the game at 720p at the lowest settings that we could set it to. CPU in this struggled. The whole time it spent 100%. Check out what's going on here. Nothing's loading. We're not even getting the model that I'm supposed to be flying in. I'm just standing straight. As we're coming into this petrol station, there's just nothing loaded. Now, this is how the whole game played. Between the load stutters from loading the world and not loading the world, to the battles with other players, which you basically only saw like 2 or 3 frames. Sadly, this game is just not playable. It is just absolute trash on this system. So average frame rate for Fortnite was 48.2 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 0.1 frames per second. Our maximum frame rates was 112.7 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows was 0.1 frames per second. Our CPU was definitely bottlenecking our GTX 660. Now maybe an overclock might fix this. Maybe there's something else we can tweak. But for us at the OFFbit, this game was just not playable. Last game for today is Valorant. This game we ran at 1080p with low settings, and this game ran silky smooth. Now at the startup, there was a couple of load-in stutters, but basically nothing happens right at that point. Once you get into the game, you have absolutely no issues. This game just tracked, it just felt great on this machine. Average frame rates for Valorant was 51.6 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 17.7 frames per second. Maximum frame rates went up to 74 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows was at 1.9 frames per second. So overall, looking at the stats, this game played smoothly. Exactly how we felt. It wasn't quite 60 frames per second experience, but it wasn't far off it either. Now, I'm going to mention a couple of games we did try to run that we couldn't get to launch. Now, we did try Call of Duty Warzone. Now, we got no errors when we ran this. We just started loading the game, and then eventually we were staring at the desktop. So we're not entirely sure what was going on, but we did try this game, and we just had no luck. Now, we did try to play Red Dead Redemption 2 with the same outcome. Basically, load into the game, we started to load up the map, and then we're just staring at the desktop. Now, if anybody knows what's going on, why we can't get into the game, please feel free to leave a comment. We would love to know what's going on. Now, let's wrap this up. The GTX660 and the Q6600. The Q6600, what a legendary processor. This is Intel's very first quad-core that was released in 2006. It's almost 15 years ago. Yes, it can't run everything these days. And yes, it can't run everything perfectly. But if you handpick and just set lower settings, you can still play games in 2020. To me, that is amazing. Now the GTX 660, it's a very good card. It's not the best card these days, but it can still play a lot of games. Now I know a lot of people have asked me, what's a good card to marry with a Core 2 quad? Now the tricky thing is, some games just need so much processor that the GPU just won't get the time to get its information. basically the CPU will bottleneck. And then you got other games where it can utilize the whole GPU. It's a tricky thing to pick because it changes from application to application or game to game. Now, I'd recommend RAM. You probably want at least 6 gig to play games these days. But you would probably be better off with 8. You may not utilize all of it with everything turned back, but it's the way to go. Alright, well that's all we got today for the Offbit. Now if you have got any questions, please put them in the comments. Now if you like this video, please hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed and you want to see more of this content, hit that subscribe button. We thank you for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time on the Offbit.